This is an important addendum to make, so I'm just going to continue to elaborate in terms of following from my last recording. So you really must listen to that recording before listening to this one. But essentially, I'm going to continue to go into the ideological, political manifestation, sorry, not just ideological, but the kind of the cultural, the intellectual culture that permeates this cultural hegemon which is essentially this narrative-centric ego function that I've described in terms of the borderline as having compartmentalization within its judgment, within its ego function judgment, in order to essentially make it possible to leverage the narrative against targets and expose people to the narrative essentially, and essentially to leverage judgments in a way which sort of confects a narrative that's capable of being exposed to someone so that it precipitates, the kind of the desired outcome or whatever. And the kind of, now that compartmentalization is not unconscious. That is bad faith. Those are structures of compartmentalization which are basically bad faith structures. And in some sense, I think in faith in general, the structure of faith in general could be generally denoted as to the kind of the character of intellectualism that characterizes a particular ego function. So essentially, if you want to talk about the state or condition of someone's faith, you're talking about how they manage or orchestrate their ego function judgment, essentially. And people that have no consistency, essentially we call psychopaths. People that have inconsistent judgments, at least in the communication of those judgments, or how they relate those judgments to others. If they can't do that with consistency, we basically that's the presentation of psychopathy. But anyway, that's just a definitional sort of jargon that I'm espousing there. But anyway, so let me get into this issue. So, because essentially the cultural hegemon within a society acclimatizes to sort of tolerating this, and even its detractors, Sam Harris and the people on the so-called left, I think they get bogged down into the bad faith. Essentially, they can't help but being infected by it, or they can't, although that they strive to be independent, critical-minded people. And to a large extent they can do that when their focus doesn't sort of get dispersed within sort of making summary narrative readings, or kind of surveys about what's going on, or sort of aggregating the input that they're getting from essentially this confected, compartmentalized sort of narrative peddling cultural hegemon. And so because all intellectualism becomes sort of shaped in that environment, that toxic environment, they get deluded, they get overridden in some sense, and they just kind of, and they make concessions to it. They go along with it because they want to seem like that they have good faith, that they're capable of challenging their own structures, and so they don't independently verify everything, and they just say, well, there's a lot of smoke, so there must be a fire, kind of sort of thing, right? And this is problematic. I actually want to I'm going to make a separate recording that's just going to be on the subject of good faith, and I've kind of already talked about psychological nescience and psychological bad faith, and I think that in some sense I need to talk about good faith more in some sense. And in some sense, the problem with good faith is that it makes you look a bit childish. It makes you look a bit immature because you don't have a ready narrative that you're peddling. You don't have a kind of a holistic treatment, and in some sense, if you have good faith, you will treat that as a kind of as a working model, waiting to see what happens if there's a contender or a confrontation, that you're willing to sort of engage with it in some sense. But everything in that sense is tentative, that your beliefs are never certain or permanent. That your beliefs are never correct. You don't have correct beliefs. That are a piece of some overarching narrative that's congruent in some sense. The only congruency is with good faith, and good faith doesn't have a sort of a pre-selected pool of good beliefs. There are no good beliefs with good faith, and in some sense, all beliefs, therefore, are also tantamount to being decontextualized and being fundamentally meaningless, because they can only be contextualized by the condition of faith that accompanies them, by the intellect, by the character of the intellect that's espousing them, the character of the judgment, as it were, which you can say has to have an internal consistency with its belief structure in some sense. But people that are centered around narrative, there is no belief structure. There's just, and this is excessively obvious or present when you're dealing with a borderline. When you're dealing with a borderline, that the case of borderline is exactly the model of this narrative-driven pseudo-intellectualism and compartmentalization of judgment in a bad faith way, in some sense, in that it doesn't even have beliefs to be consistent with. It has descriptive mass. It just has bundles and bundles and bundles of descriptive mass waiting to be activated, waiting to be cherry-picked, waiting to conform post hoc to whatever the narrative wants to unfold to next in the accomplishment of some kind of expectation. And it is fundamentally relativistic and subjective, because essentially they're always at the center of the narrative. And this is why essentially it's they have such convenient projections onto other people's intentionality and motivation, and why even it's so important to them for that to be part of the conversation, because they're not dealing in beliefs that they are congruent with. Even their beliefs are facilitating, their pseudo beliefs, which they don't even really have, are just facilitating the expansion of the narrative. That it's a power game essentially, and even their words are fundamentally meaningless. And the intellectual landscape that is commensurate with this, which is generally infected most of academia to a large extent, it's like a virus. It's so junk in its fundamental lack of integrity. It's so trashy. It's so mediocre. It's kind of like legal positivism. It's a legal theory that's capable of justifying anything just because it's written there. It's divorced from principles. It's divorced from universalism, which is why liberalism is like real liberalism is dead. The universal human project essentially has been derailed. This is why they talk about narratives and they talk about identity and they talk about justice, but where are they talking about Hong Kong and China? They don't have problems with this. They don't have problems with human rights, because it's culturally bound. It's all bound in a relativistic narrative sort of thing, and it is self-focused, it is self-centered, it is self-serving, that they are always somehow at the center of the narrative. And so everyone is the center of their sort of ethnocentric bubble in some sense, their identity bubble, and that is how things are ordered. It's like the rings, in the Lord of the Rings. 9 rings to rule the realms of men, and 6 rings to rule the whatever, the houses of the dwarven kingdoms and the kingdoms of the elves, or whatever. It's and 1 ring to rule them all, which is identity. And that kind of ethnocentric relativism, in some sense, that insulates the narrative, and that sort of, that separate but equal kind of, that's a different sort of sphere of rings, that's a different sphere of identity. I don't want to wade into that. We need to be focused on the identity issues and questions in our domain, in our locale. And you can see that the compartmentalization in judgment is there to amplify leveraging the narrative in order to essentially subvert and scapegoat and provide avenue and access to exposure to a target, exposure of the narrative to a target. It's all about opening new markets of exposure to their narrative, essentially, and they have to escalate that, or they're not making progress. And so they have to sort of corrupt and take over administration, bureaucracy, the rules. They have to make the rules. And their rules have no principles. They have no universalism. They have no equality before the law. They're fundamentally ad hoc. They're kangaroo courts. They have no integrity. They have no intellectual integrity. Instead, they have bad faith in order to keep the semblance of this unfolding narrative that leads the way, that guides the way, that is the only guiding light. So, you know, and they've even sort of repurposed the language of all good things, and they still, some of them at least, call themselves liberal. And so, you know, they have, I mean, this is what the Nazis did as well. You know, the Nazis put red on their flag because they wanted to steal, let's say, the prop of socialism. You know, of anything that has a positive connotation, they just abrogate it. They just consume it in their narrative, and they just label it on themselves in terms of their intention. And so it's interesting. Their belief about intention is one of the guiding ways of managing the kind of the intellectual bad faith, and essentially helping to corral the bundle of description that makes up reality. And you can see that how they've even acclimatized themselves to this. We can't even make sense of the COVID crisis. You know, I think that's a wonderful case of just showing how deranged and unhinged intellectualism is, journalism is, sense-making is in society. It's just, they're completely pathetic and stupid. They can't make heads or tails of, they can't listen to the real experts. They can't listen to Professor Gupta of Oxford. They can't listen to Professor Leonidas from Stanford. They follow alarmist so-called experts that misquote their own studies, or they have just completely fake studies, or well, they're not fake studies, but they're studies that will never be peer-reviewed because they're just so junk and trash, like the Imperial College study, which is the basis of all the government actions. I mean, like, they won't listen to Professor Gupta, who says, what is the point that governments are irresponsible? She says governments are basically, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but she used the word irresponsible in publishing confirmed cases because it's a meaningless number. Confirmed cases means nothing. It should not be relayed to the public. It's not a useful statistic. It's a misleading and bad statistic. It is to promote the confusion between incidence fatality and case fatality. There's a huge difference in that number. Incidence fatality is a meaningless statistic. It should not be reported on. It's worthless. It's fake news, essentially. It's been decontextualized, because if it was contextualized, it wouldn't be reported on. It's fake news, essentially. Case fatality rate is the only thing that matters, and you don't hear any of those numbers, essentially, in the news. They still keep on using the alarmist figures of incidence fatality. It's ludicrous. This is a fear-mongering, hysteria-mongering journalism class that is used to selling narratives. That's all they can do, because they're stupid, agenda-driven, activist-driven sycophants who are after the populism of this narrative-wielding cultural hegemon. These are the natural fascists, essentially. The people who are in journalism now are essentially natural fascists. In terms of their personality style. They are the henchmen, they are the field marshals. This is how they like plugging themselves into the matrix, essentially. They are like the Agent Smith, you know. Anyway, all the while, you know, sort of liberalism is dead. No one is confronting the mob. They are they are part of the mob, essentially. They're part of this runaway fascistic totalitarian narrative peddling cultural monstrosity. But okay, anyway, so I was it's if you look at like where has real liberalism gone? Well, because if you don't have universal principles, if you don't have real uh, beliefs that are held in good faith, because you only have intellectual bad faith, there are no principles anymore. There's no rationale that has any kind of coherence or consistency that is being applied. Because if that happened, then essentially they would locate themselves as being the toxic cauldron and the toxic source of dysfunction and destabilization and waste of resources and retrograde unintelligent policy that is basically, because it's got this moral corruption baked into it, it facilitates real corruption and mismanagement. Did I cover everything that I wanted to cover? Oh yeah, so I guess I should go into perhaps how I see people falling prey to the confected descriptive bundles, and then how they are essentially then they just get interpreted by some kind of moral majority. They just get interpreted by some, well, most intellectuals, when they look at this, they come to X conclusion, and then you are a heretic if you don't go along with that, because there's no fundamental, actual reasoning that's ever being extolled behind it, because essentially it's just there. What passes for reasoning is this weird kind of signaling that you are relying on the same external authority. It's all just kind of arguments from authority. And I see even Bret Weinstein making these kinds of it's that kind of tone of sentiment, that is what makes something worthy to sort of or that makes something a respectable position, or something that's real, or something like that. And well, actually, I see perhaps more with Eric in terms. I mean, in some sense, I think it's just because he's been exposed to the echo chamber in terms of whatever the articles that he reads and such. And like these intellectuals themselves, I think, are playing these very nuanced political sort of hackery, where they are trying to sort of toe the line to some extent. And so it's sort of, maybe they are putting just half a toe over the line, and so then maybe the article has a new edge to it, but it's completely confected by this, by this rotten bad faith that it's part of the mob, essentially. And I don't think we have real independent thinkers anymore. And to the extent to which we still have independent thinkers, they're still captured by the herd machination that's in the works. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'm putting this out there as a kind of yeah, and maybe they're doing it on purpose, because they can't. If they step too far outside the echo chamber, then they'll lose their audience, or they'll lose their appeal, or they'll lose their sort of, because they're trying to be a sort of maybe a bit of a gateway drug into freeing people to take the red pill or something like that. I mean, that's a kind of, it's a very sort of cynical sort of. I mean, we're all human. We're doing the best that we can, as it were. I'm loath to sort of just cotton onto that kind of sympathy garnering uh, fatalism, but and it's too easy to then attack anyone who actually has any kind of real principle, because it's very easy to leverage bundles of descriptive mass against someone. And I do see this happening against Trump. I think, I mean, it's interesting. I was watching an interview with him, and he said, I've got it mostly right. Like he even said, well, people get it wrong on some issues. Like Fauci was wrong about the masks or whatever. And I don't want to tell people what to wear in terms, like, I think masks are good, but I don't know. Uh, um, I don't think I should tell people what to do. I mean, at the very least, it is actually controversial. I mean, if Fauci got it wrong, then surely that's the definition of controversial. Um, but and he called Fauci an alarmist. And I mean, generally, I think that he is more right than at least anyone else that I see talking in the mainstream about this. And but I guess how he communicates, which is intuitively, and which is talking about sort of basic principles that he's sort of relying on to be the bones of what he's saying. You have to intuit those principles, and then you have to challenge. I mean, you could actually have a very, what's the word, incisive argument with him. An interviewer could have a very incisive argument with him if they went after the principles, but they won't even do that, because then they would actually have to have a coherent, stable position from which they were leveraging something. And then Trump would be able to actually give real answers. He would be able to say, well, what would the alternative be? If we had done that instead, then they would have said this. I mean, and Trump would be fine in that kind. If you challenged him on the principle, in essence, then he would defend the principle. He would be forced to defend the principle. But people aren't even interested in that because they're so confected into their bad faith, where it's safe. It's safe to shoot pot shots from the bad faith position. And I see Eric Weinstein doing this. I see Bret Weinstein doing this against Trump. I see Sam Harris doing this, especially with the interview with Yang. And it's, quite frankly, it's disgusting. It's easy. It's easy when you've got a bank of so-called experts cooing along with your narrative, with your fucking narrative. And you don't get into the detail. You make these summary heads of judgment, these summary which have these confected compartmentalizations built into them. And I'm calling you guys out. You're part of the mob. You're part of this popularity contest or whatever the fuck it is, and you need to clean yourself off from this. It's I'll say history won't look kindly on you uh, for this bad faith collusion. I mean, there are. I mean, I guess I haven't looked through every scandal myself, but I've looked through all the big ones. I looked through all the big controversies, all the big stinks that have been made. The impeachment, purely based on an indictment of Trump's intention of what he was doing when he made the order, when he made the phone call. Purely based on, in fact, it's only misconduct to the extent to which that he has the requisite intention in what he was doing. What he was doing by itself was not incorrect without the intention that would make, I mean, how does an indictment like that even get off the floor? It's based on an ad hominem character assassination. It is a trial of character assassination. It's fucking it's a show trial. It's a fucking show trial to extol character assassination. And it's fucking disgusting because the premise of the whole incident is the corruption of his fucking opponent, essentially. I mean, only the Democrats could repurpose a fucking story about corruption to do with their candidate as reason to try to impeach the president based on pure character assassination. I mean, like, how does this go by people? How do people tolerate this kind of cognitive dissonance? I mean, supposedly intelligent people. In some sense, the only thing you can get Trump on is, let's say, not being effective enough or being ineffectual or something like that. In which case, you actually have to say, well, something should have done something else differently or better or something like that. And I mean, obviously people will make mistakes and there'll be policy that could have been better. And, hindsight is 2020, as they say. But, you have to kind of compare this to what was being proposed at the time and actually contextualize it, let's say, in history and what was actually being debated and what was possible, as it were. And, when you put those kinds of realistic conditions into the context, I think Trump has performed fairly well given the incredibly toxic cultural media environment in which democracy is highly dysfunctional, and that has nothing to do with Trump. And in fact, Trump is the only one, I would say, actually saving democracy because of his rhetoric of civic nationalism, which directly confronts the narrative of identitarian real interests, which is a kind of like pseudo ethno nationalism, but it's a kind of transnationalism because it's like black power worldwide or some bullshit like that. You know, uh, and then you just hear more of these facile accusations against Trump being a totalitarian or being an authoritarian. It's fucking ludicrous. It, it, it couldn't be more absurd in the actual context of what's going on. Just occurred to me to also just add. I mean, this is not to add to the substance of what I was saying, but it is to somewhat illustrate the point a little bit further, but also to pose a possible sort of resolution to this. Is I would say that the general problem is that the so-called intellectual dark web. I mean, I think Jordan Peterson would also sort of might also. I mean, he tries to be a very apolitical force in some sense. He tries to not sort of wade in, but in some sense there needs to be some kind of counter pole to the kind of the echo chamber tendency of the left, um, which is much more toxic and in a bad state and and narrative centered, in this kind of borderline way and all that. And there isn't enough counterbalance with a kind of intellectualism that sort of incisively confronts that. And I do think, in some sense, that a lot of these intellectuals. I mean, Sam Harris is actually, in my mind, has famously he loves just jumping on a bandwagon that has this judgmental, sanctimonious moral certitude attached to it. Um, he loves, sort of focusing on the principles abstractly and glossing over the details of the actual sort of incidents involved. And he's happy to just summarize them as scandals, um, and go along with the hysterical so-called journalism attached to it. But I would say the voice that's sort of missing, I mean, would be someone like Victor Hansen. If Victor Hansen was in the intellectual dark web more prominently, I mean, in some sense, he's a, he predicted all of this. He predicted that Trump would do so much for the culture and do so much for politics, and he would be vilified. And how can he make that prediction almost clairvoyantly, and then Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, Bret Weinstein fit the bill of that prophecy to a T, like 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 a bit of the undead sort of zombie tendency that they have to hunt in packs and sort of in their zombie hordes, um, which I do think they have not. They're afraid, I think, to also be separated from the herd in that sense, and I know that this is even deeply insulting to Bret, who considers himself quite a maverick, and to stand on principle, and he has stood on principle, but in some sense he has been a maverick and stood on principle, but this is I mean, this is basically a bad faith argument. I mean, when I'm making an argument to do with a kind of internalized bad faith, um, I'm making a claim about a kind of nescience, about a kind of that you don't want to shake up your own reality too much, because then it would really be like living in the twilight zone. It would just be too uncomfortable, because then it would be hard to, you know, you would be leaving the kind of the world of the simple polemic to some degree, in which, things are just one thing in some sense, and it's okay to summarize something as being one thing, and Trump's one thing is just too much of a mixed bag, that you're not willing essentially to praise him in the instruments, in the arsenal that he has brought to politics, that he has brought to bear within politics, and how it is clashing with things that need to be confronted and which otherwise have no hope of being aired, have no hope of ever being brought to light. And this goes completely by the wayside as they continue to sort of be part of their chattering, critical hordes of so-called experts that have confected this descriptive bundle of reality instead of having coherent belief structures that are connected or correlated with good faith. And they're happy to plug themselves into that cesspool to sort of to navigate by that kind of that overarching purveyorship in some sense. And in that wise they have been captured by the mob. And without someone who's sort of on the ball like Victor Hansen, I feel like would really give a counterpoint to a lot of these things. Because I mean, a lot of the people on the right are very even critical of some of Trump's moves, but there is really a lot of intellectual sympathy, especially in, I mean, you can't expect politics to work when journalism is so broken, when sense-making is so broken, democracy can hardly function. And the level to which essentially Trump is still, I would say, a participant in the actual democratic model, he is a good actor. He is a good agent. I mean, when I say good actor, I mean not that he's acting the part. I mean that he is acting with fidelity to the structure. And in some sense, he is the only good actor in politics that I can really see. And to the extent to which that the party is being acclimatized to his way of doing things, the Republican Party, it is reforming potentially for the better. It is putting the Republican Party into a state in which it is much far further along the path of renaissance or revivification or any kind of resemblance of party politics that could be deemed as respectable. Obviously, it's very far from that. The state of the party, the state of both parties, Bret is very correct about how he diagnoses these things in terms of the problems that the parties have. But he therefore uses that as an excuse to not look at the minutiae, to not look at the nuance of whose platform is actually more integral, which platform is actually more sort of authentic or genuine or hopeful or resembling of something that can actually bridge itself towards, kind of, and it's obvious that the Democratic Party is far worse than the Republican Party, because at least the Republican Party has values that it has to at least ostensibly cater to. The Democratic Party, because of the narrative functioning, the functional empathy of the narrative, as it were, has this bad faith mechanism directly woven into the ideology. It is poison. It is utter poison. And to the extent to which Joe Biden can't talk against that ideological poison, he's fundamentally prone and captured to it, which makes his candidacy a dangerous prospect for America, and essentially trying to not bring that to a resolution, bring that to a head and a resolution, which Trump is you could say he's what do those alt-right people call it? Can't remember what they call it, but it's like escalating to some extreme. Maybe they call it escalation, but I think it's a different word that means, sort of like escalating it to apocalyptic proportions. Well, you do need to hash it out. It does need to be hashed out on the stage of something. And if you don't even offer, let's say, good faith resistance to something, cultural resistance to something, which Trump is the only bastion of it in politics, essentially. You look at how many Republicans marched with Black Lives Matter. It's how many Democrats spoke out against it? How can these intellectuals, Bret, Sam in particular, I guess, Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein, can within that context not praise Trump? Not have anything good to say about him? When I say praise, I don't mean praise the Lord. I don't mean praise God. I don't mean it in a religious diminutive sense. I mean it in terms of commending him. You can't find anything commendable to say. In fact, all I hear whenever I hear Bret talk about Trump is he's actually always fucking talking about dog whistles. He's saying, yeah, no, that was a kind of dog whistle. He doesn't use the word dog whistle, but that's essentially the summary of the content, of the substance that he's communicating. That's all he has to say about it. Really. Really, that's it. This is the state of liberal intellectualism. This is what, I think that this is the end of the liberal intellectual. I think this is the end of liberal intellectualism. Because it's a groupthink, essentially. It even in it wants a more positive groupthink. It wants it wants a better humane groupthink or something like that. But it still wants its bandwagon. It's a bandwagon ideology. And Bret, I'm sad to say, is exemplifying that. He's proving my case, at least I mean, maybe I'm cherry picking things. Maybe he has. I mean, I haven't watched every podcast, you know, so maybe he has said some commendable things. Maybe I'm wrong, in fact, on this issue. But and maybe it has something to do with, you know, the idea that the intellectual must have this concise, clear, and I mean, I'm certainly not such a clear thinker in that I don't produce this picturesque, solid story. I'm sort of reasoning through it as I'm talking about it. I don't have notes. I don't, you know, I think vaguely about what I want to say and I come to a few conclusions and then I try to replicate them when I'm actually got the recording button on. So, you know, I mean, certainly I think a lot of what I could say would be much better in dialogue, would be much better in a kind of participatory conversation, and things would come out much more organically, and I wouldn't have this rattling diatribe sort of tone or whatever. But and it would be far more organic, and I could actually take people through things. And perhaps there's some things that I haven't thought through quite properly, because I mean, I did want to make a recording about good faith, and I haven't probably thought it all out perfectly. And I did go over some of the mechanics of that, which, you know, I sort of just kind of spit out in my haphazard sort of way, the parts that I have thought about. I guess, I mean, I guess I prefer to sort of hash things out when I'm sort of, as I'm explaining it to someone, and then I'm explaining it to myself at the same time. And I do have an intuitive grasp of all the parts, and I do have a kind of understanding of how they work together, but my vocabulary is actually not that great, and so sometimes I have to sort of find the right words, and the context of TI is even, I think, a metaphysical issue that is problematic, because I am afraid of TI conforming to a narrative in some sense, and then it's sort of the spirit of the context gets sort of um, dogmatically encoded into a kind of so in some sense, you know, that's a kind of a protective strategy, or or a or a concerted method that I am constantly employing, so that I am not trapped by a kind of definitional. Um, I mean, I'm willing to be trapped by inconsistencies that I make, but essentially, you know, there is a way in which you can sort of hold people to the letter of what they have said, and it bears no resemblance to the actual contents of their purport, or because the teleos essentially never gets secured by the faith of what they were doing as they were communicating, is just gets misrepresented essentially. And that is also, I think, also how bad faith gets baked into bandwagon groupthink and things like that. And that's one of the sort of the conventions that are used and traded on by people that coerce and cajole, and in some sense President Trump is immune to that, because he has a similar method. He essentially doesn't communicate in a way in which you can bind him to the definition of the words that he uses, but in the undercurrent of the flow of the you know. So if you actually say, you can confront him if you want to, you can actually construct questions, and you could actually sort of you could incisively go after him, but then you would very soon realize that he is a machine that is functioning on principles and you better have better principles or better way of manifesting those principles, and then he would have to answer those questions, and then perhaps he would have to, and then perhaps you would actually see some real humility, because then he would say, actually, yeah, your reasoning does work a bit better than mine, and yeah, I guess I'll adopt that. And then you'll see, oh my word, we've been calling him a narcissist all this time because we haven't been speaking his language, because we're a vacuous, hysterical field marshals of a totalitarian groupthink. And we can't deal with this person because he's actually higher energy. And he's representative of something that is, that we can only throw aspersions and accusations against. Okay, so I mean, I think that Trump as a tactician, in terms of how it's built into his method of communication, represents so many positive things for American politics that might not, it's not, just because Trump isn't going to be able to solve this problem by himself. I mean, it depends what happens after him, essentially. Trump is not the solution, but he is a catalyst for the solution. And if he is not respected as such, I mean, well, to me, that's just more proof of that the state of intellectualism is just sort of so far gone, is just so disconnected from reality. And again, I mean, I just, to me, when I see people trashing Trump, they are discrediting themselves. They're actively discrediting themselves, and they deserve that discredit. But they're too afraid, I guess, not to, because everyone else is doing it. And if you don't do it, then you can't even have a seat at the so-called intellectual table. And that's how it fucking operates. It's like a mafia. That's how I see it, anyway. I guess, I'm just saying that they have that I see it as an act of bad faith. And they can just say, well, no, we just happen to agree with the mob because, on this issue, the mob isn't always wrong. There's that kind of defense, and I can't really rejoin that. I can't really counter-argue the secondary point. Anyway, I guess that's the end of my rant.